Hello everyone, welcome to Discover Spiritism Network. My name is Mauricio Cisneiros and I'm here today with Luis Lima. Welcome, Luis, to the network.
Thank you very much. Thanks for letting me be part of the DSN.
There we go. And so today we're going to be talking a little bit about Spiritist Dissemination, beginning with a question to Luis, who has been disseminating Spiritism in the USA for many, many years. And I guess the question would be, what do you think about Spiritism, the dissemination Spiritism nowadays in the US, Luis?
Yeah, I think it's pretty good. Obviously, it's going slow. It's a slow process, but it's happening. And one interesting thing is, and I get this question all the time from the American audience, why Brazilians? What do you guys have to do with that? What are you doing in the middle? Why not from France to the US? To begin with, most on the American audience, most Spiritist beginners in the American audience, they don't even know Spiritism starts right here in the US in 1848 with the Fox sisters. They think it starts with Allan Kardec in France. So, but regardless, the question they ask me is, why not from France to the US? Why Brazil? Why are you guys so strong in Spiritism? And I think we should maybe use the time that we have here to address that a little bit, explain a little bit. And of course, it all starts with Allan Kardec in France, going to these physical manifestations or demonstrations, turning tables, flying chairs, and all of that. So Spiritism starts with a set of books, the codification, and it starts in 1857. These manifestations were happening strongly in Europe. They were very important in the French community because they were catching a lot of attention in the early 1850s, 51, 52, and in 54, Allan Kardec goes to his first
session,
because he wouldn't believe, and he said, "Not me. I need to see it."
Yeah.
So he saw it, and anyway. It all starts right there. Now, we are really interested in what happens after Allan Kardec's death. By the way, during the time he was alive, his 12 years as Allan Kardec, the same type of manifestation happening in Paris and throughout Europe was happening in Brazil too. In a smaller scale, but yeah, here and there, they were happening. And in like a disorganized form. One group didn't know about the other until much later. But it was happening. Now, the Spiritist movement in Brazil starts to be a lot stronger after Allan Kardec's death.
Mm-hmm.
When he died in 1869, things change. Within the 12 years that he was alive, because of commercial reasons, the city of Rio de Janeiro in Brazil and the city of Paris in France had a very strong connection because of commercial reasons. And there were a lot of traveling businessmen going back and forth all the time, which today it's something very, very common, but in those days it wasn't. Two cities to have a bond like that, it wasn't something very common, but it was. So if you think about Spiritism in France, it was in the middle upper class. It was not in the masses when it started. And the people doing these traveling were businessmen. There were people educated, middle upper class.
Who spoke French and all that.
Spoke French, right. And these guys were coming to the city of Rio de Janeiro in Brazil, and they were bringing the books with them to read. These books, the Allan Kardec's books, the codification, they would make their way into the Brazilian community that knew French because of the business going between the two cities. So the Brazilians could read French in those days. So they would just read Spirit's book and everything else. And at one point, we started associating what was in the books with these small manifestations here and there. So the thing got into a second level. Now it's a lot more than just people bringing books in a ship. It's a lot more than that.
Yeah.
So that's how Spiritism starts in Brazil, in the very beginning. Now, actually, Allan Kardec makes he has mentions of letters that he wrote to Brazilian people, not really Spiritist centers in the way that we know today, but to people, because Spiritism was happening here. And in the Spiritist Review, he publishes an article saying, and I heard from people in Brazil, and that's nice. And so, slowly it was happening in Brazil. After he died, things changed radically, because first of all, he died. It's not because he was ill for such a long time. It was something expected. He wasn't. He died, dropped dead on March 31st, 1869, just like that. So the closer group to him, those were his wife, or his widow now, Amélie Boudet, Gabriel Delany and his dad, from Camille from Marion, Léon Denis. Those were the Pierre Le Marie. Pierre Le Marie was part of the mediumship group. So these people close to him had to decide what to do. So, and they had slightly different opinions. So one group follows, and they founded something called the French Spiritist Union, and the other group found something else called the Anonymous Society, because they were not getting along.
Right.
The Anonymous Society was much bigger in number of people, though most people followed that path, and it was led by Pierre Le Marie. And these people here said, this is not going to be good. This is going to be a disaster. So they completely broke apart at a certain point. As of 1871-72, this group here, led by Pierre Le Marie, they found themselves in charge of publishing the books, continued to publish the Spiritist Review, because until Kardec's death, it was him, Allan Kardec himself,
was doing
writing
review,
everything,
yes.
100% of it. So Pierre Le Marie and his group, they kind of took over and started to continue to publish the Spiritist Review with articles and so. But some of the articles were like questionable, strange to what Allan Kardec had left behind and what the other group was thinking. So they actually, parted ways completely.
Yes.
This group here, Pierre Le Marie and his people, they, by the way, Pierre Le Marie was a businessman, but he went bankrupt. So he needed money, bad. He needed money. And he and his wife, they were broke. So what he said is, well, we're going to found this Spiritist, they call Anonymous Society, but the directory is going to have, they're going to be paid. The president makes a salary as the directors do, which is something completely off the original movement. So again, he was a businessman prior to that, and he needed money. And he started to use the books as a source of income. His publishing company. So he was publishing the Spiritist Review with some articles that would catch the public's attention. So he would sell more books, more of the issues on the Spiritist Review, but not necessarily they were, the content was what it should have been. Yeah. But anyway, he made a lot of money on it. He organized in different parts of the city of Paris, in theaters, sessions where people could go in, pay, and go in to see manifestations and stuff like that. But later on, we came to know that they were all fraudulent. It was, a lot of, it was all prepared, they were all staged. It didn't really happen. And at one point, he got in jail. He was locked up. He had to be locked up, because he wanted to transform Spiritism into a business that he could take advantage of, making profit on the books and everything else. So when this word got out there that everything was fraudulent, that includes, by the way, one very questionable translation of the book on Genesis that was altered. There's 200 alterations made by him, Pierre Le Maurice, on the 5th and 6th edition of the Genesis, which are not the original. So when this thing got out there, Spiritism was regarded as something fraudulent in France, and from there in Europe. So this thing is no good, we don't want to hear about it. And because they became much a larger group than the original group, there was only a few people, Spiritism went into the kind of a blacklist.
Yeah.
This is not true, this
Total
is all
lack
staged.
of interest, yeah.
Yeah, you know, so forget about it. So Spiritism, from there on, and that's in the late 1870s, 1880s, it starts to disappear. Okay, so that's in France. In Brazil, what's happening is the movement is growing because of those books that got into Brazil originally in French, and they were being read, they were being studied, and, you know, the word started to get out there slowly, but it did. Until a certain point where several Spiritist centers were being formed in different places of the city, in different parts of the country, and a small group of people decided to organize this. Let's organize the movement because it's all scattered. Let's try to, you know, have something consistent. And they found what today is known as the Brazilian Spiritist Federation, to put it all together to organize the movement and make it easier for everybody. That was the original goal. So that was done. That's 1884. And it made it easier, I would say, for the Brazilian movement to, you know, to grow as it could, until in 1895, one man becomes the president of the Brazilian Federation. His name, Bezerra de Menezes. Very well-known name in Spiritism in Brazil, out of Brazil, and here in the U.S., very well-known. He was actually a doctor, medical doctor, and he had a lot of connections in politics because of his history as a, you know, from a young age.
Yeah.
So and so he becomes president, takes office in 1895. Now, 4 years prior to that, okay, in 1889, 1890, the Brazilian Penal Code was being prepared, and it was published, I think, in 91, maybe 1890, 1891. Within that publication, the Brazilian Penal Code, Spiritists were regarded as something bad. They could not practice Spiritism. They were not allowed to. So that we go back to the first days of Christianity. Very similar.
Exactly.
Right?
Exactly.
So Brazilians could not, Spiritists could not study. They couldn't find a place to get together. We go back in time. Same thing as early Christianity. So when this man, Bezerra de Menezes, takes office, he said, no, we need to organize this, we need to change this, we need to go to the government and explain what is Spiritism, because they don't know. They're giving us this because they think Spiritism is this, when in reality is this. So he was able to change that. That's a great achievement. And not only that, in 1897, the books were being published in France by Pierre Le Maurice still. So Bezerra de Menezes go to him and says, listen, Spiritism in France is disappearing. Why don't you give me the right to translate and publish the books, Allan Kardec's books and the Spiritist Review and everything, in Portuguese language? And Le Maurice said, I don't want it. You can have it. Just give it to him. He just gave it to him. So the Brazilian Spiritist Federation now is in charge, or it owns all the publishing rights and translations of the codification in Brazilian Portuguese and in Portugal's Portuguese language. And that changes everything, because now you can translate and have these books presented to the masses, not only the upper class in the city of Rio de Janeiro. And another interesting thing is, think about Europe. You have, let's say, 20 countries. Each country speaks one language. If you publish a book in France, in French, it's good for France. It doesn't help Portugal or Spain because of languages. Right. Now, in Brazil, you have a tremendous sizable land, but it's all the same language.
A lot of people, same language. Yeah.
Right, so with one publication, one translation, you get a lot more people, a lot more exposure than languages in Europe. That's an interesting fact. So it made it very easy for Spiritism to make it to the masses in Brazil.
Yeah,
and that's what it is today.
And just opening a parenthesis on that, nowadays there's about 7 or 8 translations to Portuguese from the codification.
Right.
Nowadays.
Right. And it's very easy to get the book.
Yeah.
So you go to a city in Brazil, you just walk into a bookstore and buy it.
Yeah.
Because of the size of the country and the exposure that Spiritism had with the books being translated. So from a very slow, tiny process, it became something a lot more significant. And it is today. Spiritism in Brazil is huge. And then the next important thing is Brazilian medium Chico Xavier in 1964-65. He was here in the U.S. and he was trying to help the movement. So he went here, he visited Spiritist centers, trying to get the thing rolling, get the ball rolling. But again, if you don't have books in English, that's going to be complicated. But anyway, so the next important thing, I think, it happens in 1988. 1988, a young man in Brazil, he was in the youth studies in one of the Spiritist centers in Brazil, and he came to the U.S. and he saw tremendous potential to bring Spiritism over to the U.S. Why am I saying this? Come on, the man is right here. That's him. You talk about it instead of me. Go ahead, please.
Oh yeah.
So you got here in 1988, right?
Yeah. Back then there was really nothing going on here as far as Spiritism dissemination went. As far as I knew, there was no internet, there was no cell phones, none of that. So in my case, I missed it so much because I grew up studying Spiritism that I started doing meetings in my own home. Only like a year after that or so is where we were able to find some other people in Miami, and then we found another group, like 2 groups in Miami, and then way after that we got to know people in Washington, in Phoenix, in Philadelphia, and from there on we were able to start getting together to think about what the best ways would be of disseminating Spiritism. Back then there was really, like as far as translations went, there was really nothing really. It was just a couple books from Anna Blackwell and the Gospel According to Spiritism from Janet Duncan. But I think that came even later on, I think.
And
but
those
that was it.
British translations. So.
Yeah, British translations.
Of
yes.
course, it's English, but it's a little difficult after a certain while for the American public to follow, because each language, is slightly different. The terms are not the same. So I think we needed American English translations.
Which has been happening, little by little. I mean, this is like 30 years back. Nowadays, we probably have more than 100 translations done here in the U.S. and for the American English-speaking public. Yeah.
And that made it easier to
it's a lot easier today because people come to you and they're like, oh, I would like to know about Spiritism, and not only have the Spirits book, but you can also give them other books according to what their preferences are in studying Spiritism, different topics and all that.
And today we have several of our big cities here in the U.S. They have at least one Spiritist center. Yeah. So it's growing. It's so
little
nice.
By little.
Yeah. So we come from decades ago on this thing, and it's so nice to see the American public having.
Yeah, compared to Brazil, Brazil is what 100 and some 50 years, I think. Spiritism has been there, so it's a big difference in the time span. Of disseminating Spiritism.
So we're still in baby stages.
Yeah, we keep on thinking, what is it going to be 100 years from now?
It's going to be different.
When we reincarnate here, and I think it's going to be Spiritism is going to be a lot more expanded. I think.
Yeah. Yeah, and when we look today, when we look at this guy Pierre Lemarie and all the trouble he caused, that's actually something organized by the spiritual realm. That there was a need, I think, to move, to take the movement away from Europe and bring it somewhere else, to fresh land per se. So it's all organized in the spiritual realm. What we did here is mention historical facts as a consequence of, the spiritual prep for all this thing to happen. So this Lemarie becomes almost like a necessary evil, if you will. It all happened when he decided to kind of go wrong, but the spiritual realm was in charge and made it happen. And I also get this question a lot: why not from France to the U.S.?
Yeah, I was just gonna ask you that.
Yeah,
why Brazil and not the U.S.?
Yeah, what does Brazil have to do with that?
Yeah.
Well, a very interesting thing. The same way that it all started here in the U.S. in Hydesville with the Fox sisters, and we didn't pay attention to that because we weren't ready for it. The U.S. culture wasn't ready for that kind of thing. So these things moved to Europe. So can you imagine if in those days, the first days of Spiritism, the first days of codification, if you try to bring to the U.S. the mentality or the idea of reincarnation and anything that follows it, we're not ready for it. We would shut down the door. It would be a lot worse to bring it in later.
Yeah.
So I think the cultural connection between France and the U.S. was not favorable enough. But the cultural connection between Brazil and U.S. is different.
Right.
The American public accepts a lot more what comes from Brazil than what comes from France, especially in those days. So I think that's a huge part of it.
Right.
There's a lot of Brazilian culture spread throughout the U.S.
Yeah.
And there is not kind of restriction. No, we don't like you. No, it's the other way around. And we like you. It's interesting. And when I say cultural, it's really cultural. Samba and different things, they made their way into the U.S. easily. So Brazilians are coming here. They started to come in here, bringing their books, their Brazilian translations of the codification. That codification, that's what you just said, right? Got in here and got translated into English and so on and so. So the same thing that happened from France to Brazil is now happening from Brazil to the U.S.
Right.
And of course, because of an economic power, the U.S., once things get in here, they spread fast. And that's going to be something really interesting, like you said, 100 years from now.
Yeah, and not only through Spiritism. I mean, we see so much dissemination of Spiritist principles through other means, other religions, other science, especially, which is really catching on nowadays. People such as Brian Wise and there's so many others who are disseminating some of those principles. I mean, the principle of reincarnation, for example, right? So, Spiritism may not be, it is not the only tool to disseminate these ideas. And which is really the important thing, is dissemination of the actual ideas and not of Spiritism itself, in the sense that, we want everybody to be Spiritist. That's not, the idea. Although some people think that way.
No, but it's not. Yeah, no. In here, I personally, when do talks and people ask me also, medicine and spirituality. It's one of these big things right now. Yeah. We have a lot of explanations given by Spiritism that are now being validated by science in terms of medicine, medical treatment in general, right? How to look at at a person, not as a physical body, not as a collection of 70 trillion cells, but there's a lot more than this.
Yeah.
So these things are starting to walk together.
Yeah.
Instead of you see, that's an interesting thing. If you go back in time, let's say 50 or 60 years ago, and you put on a same table quantum physicists here and spiritualists here, they would fight.
Mm-hmm.
You wouldn't have fire, you wouldn't have a lot of aggressiveness.
Yeah.
Today, that does not happen. They use different names.
Mm-hmm.
But, they talk. There's a more of a common ground that is understood by this side in relation to that one, or that side in relation to this. So it's all happening now, and Spiritism has that missing link to explain to these two people this is what it is, because it's in all our books.
Yeah.
So, and I think that's very important to the U.S. Dissemination here, because they are, very scientific mind in the U.S.
There we go. There we go.
That's it. Well,
all right.
All right. Thank you, guys. We're gonna be here at DSN weekly. Okay. So glad to be here.
Talking about different topics. Luis is going to be going over all of what has been said in details, many other details, and we welcome everyone's input and suggestions to different topics that can be discussed here. Thank you so much. Thank you, Luis.
All right. Thank you.